This is part two of my conversation with Francisco Rodríguez. He is currently the chief economist at Torino Economics in New York City and a former head of the National Assembly's Economic and Financial Advisory Office in Venezuela and a former advisor to Venezuelan opposition presidential candidate Henri Falcon. In part one, Francisco Rodríguez warned of a famine in Venezuela as a result of U.S. sanctions.
At this moment, given the information that we have, the most reasonable conclusion based on the data is that a famine is going to occur in Venezuela over the course of the next 12 months.
And in part two, we're going to talk more about that and also hear his criticisms of the Maduro government and get into a discussion about Venezuelan democracy today. But first, I began by asking Francisco Rodríguez about whether or not he feels the international community is adequately responding to warnings from people like him that there could be a famine in Venezuela as a result of U.S. sanctions and could possibly kill hundreds of thousands of people.
I think that there is a growing acknowledgement among some circles. I mean, you've seen the international press, for example, the same weekend, the New York Times and the Financial Times writing about the risk of famine in Venezuela. You had an editorial by the Financial Times on the effect of sanctions, which in fact its conclusion is that they concluded with the line that famine is too high a price to pay for regime change. So I do think that there is awareness in some circles. Now, it's not clear to me that U.S. authorities are fully aware. And also what really does concern me is that there is very little talk about, if any, about what needs to be done in order to stop this from happening. Whenever we have this discussion, it seems to be it seems to get closeted into this dilemma of, okay, well, if you oppose sanctions, then that means that you're calling for a lifting of sanctions, and therefore you're seen as favoring the Maduro regime. And I mean, I can tell you my personal view. I think that Maduro has managed the economy of this country disastrously, and I also believe that he's done a lot of damage to the country. But this question is not really about who's responsible. I mean, that is an important and relevant question. But the question is, how do we stop hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans from dying, from starving to death this year? One of the alternatives that I've proposed is the creation of an oil for food program for Venezuela, as was done in Iraq, something that would allow Venezuela to resume oil exports to the U.S., but with the management of the funds obtained and the proceeds obtained from sales of that oil should be overseen by international agencies and perhaps also by the Venezuelan National Assembly to assure that they're used only for the purchases of goods that are essential either to the survival of Venezuelans or to the functioning of the Venezuelan economy. So there are alternatives out there that should be discussed, and maybe it is an oil for food program as I proposed. Maybe there are other alternatives, but I'm very concerned by the lack of discussion of what we're going to do to stop hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans from starving to death.
Well, another option is just to drop the sanctions entirely, right? I mean, the oil for food program in Iraq does not have the most encouraging legacy. You had two UN coordinators there who were responsible for overseeing the oil for food program and the sanctions resigning in protest because they felt as if the sanctions that they were a part of imposing were genocidal to Iraqis.
I mean, surely that is a policy option, but there you get into kind of other complex issues, which is that the international community, I mean, there seems to be broad agreement in the international community that, at least the Western international community, that some type of sanctions should be levied on the Venezuelan regime. And I definitely agree with the purpose of these sanctions, which is to try to get the Venezuelan government to hold fair and free elections, to respect the rule of law, to respect the Venezuelan National Assembly that was elected by Venezuelans. So there, the question becomes much more complex, which is what are we going to do to also solve the problem of the lack of democracy in Venezuela? And that's where personally I would say that my limitations as an economist in talking about these issues should be brought forward. I mean, what I'm doing as an economist is looking at the effect that sanctions have had and looking at the effect that and looking at what would need to be done and what are the different policy alternatives that could be used in order to stop this from happening. But there is a broader set of discussion as to whether the sanctions are going to lead to regime change in Venezuela, whether they're going to lead for Venezuelan to have more democratic institutions and more democratic elections. And that is a discussion that neither have I personally delved into, nor necessarily do I feel that I'm the person that should be having this discussion. I mean, I think it's an important discussion for policymakers. It's an important discussion for Venezuelan politicians. It's an important discussion for Venezuelans generally. But I do think that whenever you assess sanctions, you have to evaluate both what their costs and their benefits are. What I'm saying here is, look, whatever the rationale for designing them was, what I can show you as an economist is, and using the results of our research, is an assessment of what the costs are. And the costs are very high, according to what the data is telling us.
I wanted to ask you, because I think you have a pretty unique window into the state of Venezuelan democracy, because you were a top advisor on the campaign of Henri Falcon, who ran against Nicolas Maduro in the last presidential election. We hear often about Maduro being a dictator. That's what his Western critics here accuse him of. But I wanted to ask you, is it true that the U.S., in a bid to undermine those elections, is it true that the U.S. government tried to pressure Falcon to drop out of the race and even threatened him with sanctions in order to do so?
Yeah. I mean, on that last question, that's not a question for me. I mean, if such a conversation happened, I wasn't in there. So if you want to talk to Falcon and interview Falcon, I think that would be a great idea, and he can answer that directly. On the issue of the elections, I mean, I'll go back a bit to what happened towards the end of the elections, because this is really important. Towards the end of the elections, in the last few weeks of the elections, President Maduro started invoking the use of the card of the fatherland in government rallies, and basically started saying, and he promised that voters would be paid if they went to vote. And this is something that in Venezuelan legislation and generally that they would be paid through the card of the fatherland. In Venezuelan legislation, and generally in legislation in most modern democracies, is illegal, and it's considered a type of fraud. This is vote buying. In Peru, for example, just a few years ago, we had one of the running candidates, Cesar Acuña. The Electoral Council invalidated his candidacy on the evidence of vote buying, even without going that far. In the same Venezuela, back in 2015, the Electoral Court invalidated the election of 4 legislators from the state of Amazonas because of evidence of vote buying. And the evidence was a tape recording of the secretary of the pro-opposition governor saying that they were going to send some money for the purchase of votes. So there wasn't actual direct evidence that the vote buying took place. It was indirect evidence. Here we have the president of the country on a national address, which was, by the way, that particular one was actually broadcast all over the country using Venezuelan legislation that can compel broadcasters to take it, saying those who come out and vote, they're going to get paid a bonus in the card of the fatherland. That is an electoral crime. That is a violation of Venezuelan electoral law, and that by itself is sufficient to invalidate the elections. And this is very serious because we're talking about a country that is in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. We're talking about a country where Venezuelans are going hungry, and you're basically taking the power of the state, which is to say, okay, I have a way in which I can stop your hunger, but you have to come out and vote. So that because of that, and we alleged, and we went to the Electoral Council, we went to the Supreme Court before the elections. We tried to get an order from the Supreme Court, effectively to bar Maduro from using the card of the fatherland in the campaign. The Supreme Court did not rule in our favor, and therefore, right after the election, Henri Falcon, with the total support of all of his campaign, myself included, said we are not going to recognize the results of this election. Now, we were very concerned from the start about violations about other violations of Venezuelan electoral law, and in fact, violations of the basic freedoms of Venezuelans. However, we decided that we were going to participate in that election because Venezuelans should have a right to change their president and to vote against Maduro and to elect another president through the ballot box. However, we believe that the guarantees were not respected and that those were not free and fair elections, and therefore we're calling for those elections to be repeated, which, by the way, would be a solution to the Venezuelan crisis, the Venezuelan political crisis. There is currently a demand before the Supreme Court, before the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court. What it has to do is, consistently with the Electoral Court decisions of 2015 and 2016, it should invalidate the 2018 presidential election and call for new presidential elections to be held.
I think it's currently difficult to do anything in this current environment where you have the U.S. trying to foment a military coup and while meanwhile imposing these crippling, murderous sanctions.
I mean, I agree that the U.S. has not helped, and I think that a big part of the reason why we didn't have an electoral resolution to the Venezuelan problem was that the U.S. gave very strong support to the group that decided to boycott the election. And I also think that, when you look at public opinion studies and you look at why so many people who were opposed to Maduro did not come out and vote, many of them did not come out and vote because they believed in what the opposition leaders were telling them, which is if we don't participate in this election, then the international community is going to take care of Maduro, and that proved to be wrong. And now Venezuelans are stuck in, for me, is the worst of two worlds. I mean, they get to keep Maduro as president and have their economy sanctioned. So I agree that U.S. foreign policy has been completely wrongheaded here, but I do think that there is a fundamental issue here that we do need to address, which is the real state of political and civil liberties, as documented in the recent Bachelet report, for example, of basic civil and human rights in Venezuela, and that something needs to be done so that Venezuelans can decide the future of their country through democratic elections.
Well, I was struck by the fact that the Bachelet report by the UN did not even mention the opposition violence against Chavistas, part of a larger trend, I think, to ignore the crimes carried out against supporters of Chavez and Maduro.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say, I agree that there has been serious violence on both sides, that there has been aggression against Chavistas, and in fact, I believe that that violence should have been condemned by opposition leaders. The fact that no leader of the mainstream opposition, again with the exception of Henri Falcon, has condemned the burning of somebody who was identified as Chavista in an opposition demonstration last year is a very serious cause for concern. However, it is one thing for there to be political violence, and it is another thing for there to be violation of human rights. The country's opposition cannot violate human rights. It can commit crimes. It cannot violate human rights. The role of protecting, of ensuring that human rights are guaranteed and protected in a country is the role of the government. So there's a difference here. If there are some people who are going around burning other people, those are criminals. If it is the state that is allowing such acts, for example, of torture to happen, then the state is not complying with its basic responsibility to ensure that all Venezuelans should have their civil, political, and human rights respected. And that is why, if you look at human rights agencies, if you look at UN reports in other countries, they will always, I mean, if you look even at the reports of the UN in Colombia, for example, you will see that they focus on what the state is doing. That is their interlocutor, and that is the only one that has a responsibility for protecting human rights from the standpoint of international law. The fact that there are other people who can commit criminal acts, yes, I mean that exists. It is terrible. It should be condemned. Venezuelan political leaders should be condemning those acts of violence, and it's regrettable that some of them on the opposition have not done so. But that's not a human rights violation. That is an expression of political violence, and in certain cases, such as this one, a crime and a highness.
And I'll just say here that I'm aware of the many criticisms that exist of the Maduro government. I've spoken to economists who say that there was serious mismanagement of the economy. My main concern, though, is as a Westerner, I can't look at the struggles that Venezuela has faced and the decisions that the government has taken outside of the context it's in, which to me includes a ongoing effort by the U.S. to overthrow the Chavista movement, going back to the U.S.-backed coup in 2002, pouring tens of millions of dollars into the opposition, Obama declaring Venezuela to be a national security threat. Now, of course, this coup under Trump. And meanwhile, the U.S. supporting far-right elements of the opposition that have shunned dialogue, that have rejected the results of so many elections in Venezuela that the Chavista movement has won. And it's difficult for me to expect the Venezuelan government to act in full accordance with all norms when it's under siege in this way, and it's dealing with people who I think are not acting in good faith.
I agree with that, but I don't think that justifies what the government has done. And there I'd like to point to an important distinction. And I've been a critic of Chavez and a strong critic of the Chavez government, and for decades. But back in 2004, when there was that crisis after the coup attempt, after the strike, Chavez accepted going to, he complied with Venezuelan law. He accepted going to a referendum, which he won, where the majority of Venezuelans voted in his favor, said we don't want Chavez to leave. So Chavez decided that he was going to subject himself to the Venezuelan democratic process. However, in 2016, the Venezuelan opposition tried to invoke the same process, the same recall referendum, and Maduro, with completely specious arguments, using the control not even of the Supreme Court but of local courts, invalidated that referendum call. So Venezuelans did not have the possibility of deciding, like the Venezuelan Constitution says that they should, whether they wanted Maduro to remain as president. So we have both problems here. But I do think that there is, I mean, for me as a Venezuelan, there's a very serious one here. We have somebody that Venezuelans do not want to be in the presidency and who does not leave the presidency because he controls state institutions.
As I understand it, that recall option exists because it was passed by the Chavista movement with the 1999 Constitution. And I get the critique, but at the same time, we don't fault Donald Trump for not standing for a recall election in the U.S. because that isn't an option for him. And I look at Maduro and I see someone who has dealt with an opposition that has refused to recognize him. And so I can't fully fault him for refusing to, fully play ball with an opposition who, at least elements of it, have acted in bad faith.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, there are many different sectors in the opposition, and I do believe that some of them have acted in bad faith, and I think that others have not. However, more broadly, if Donald Trump was violating the U.S. Constitution, and if the U.S. Constitution said that Americans had the right to a recall election, then yes, I mean, I think that there would be an uproar in this country. So in this country where I'm at currently, which is the United States. And you said something which I mean I'd like to correct, because you said that this constitution was, I mean, if I understood your phrasing correctly, that it was brought to Venezuela by the Chavistas, by Chavismo. And while it is true that the constitutional process was initiated by Chavismo, the Constitution was designed by a constituent assembly that was elected by all Venezuelans, and that Constitution was approved by all Venezuelans by an overwhelming majority. So it is the Constitution of Venezuela, the Constitution that Venezuelans decided they wanted to have as their basic social contract going forward. That enshrines the principle that democracy must be participatory, it isn't just representative, and it enshrines the principle that Venezuelans should have the right to revoke the mandate of their elected officials. So I do think that given that that is a constitutional right, it is very serious that Maduro is violating it, and I do think that it represents a violation of the key democratic principles, because the democratic principles are embodied in how the Constitution or social contract says that they should be carried out. It's not like, I mean, imagine, Trump tomorrow said, okay, we're not going to have the elections in 2020. We're going to have them in 2022 because I need the economy to get more time to recover. And anyway, we're going to have elections. It's going to be an election every 6 years, and a lot of countries have that. So we're not less democratic than them. No, that would be wrong, because Donald Trump does not have the right to decide when elections are held. This is something that's enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. In the same way, I, as a Venezuelan, believe that the Venezuelan Constitution should be afforded the same level of respect that the U.S. Constitution should for Americans. And therefore, I think that violating the basic electoral rights as enshrined in the Constitution, in the Venezuelan Constitution, is a serious violation of our democracy.
Francisco Rodríguez is currently the chief economist at Torino Economics in New York City. He is also a former head of the National Assembly's Economic and Financial Advisory Office in Venezuela, and a former advisor to Venezuelan presidential candidate Henri Falcon. Francisco Rodríguez, thank you very much.
Thank you.